I never imagined that walking through those marble corridors for the first time as a congresswoman would feel like entering a different world entirely. You see the polished floors, the historic paintings, the formal ceremonies on television, but what you don't see is what happens when those cameras turn off and the real business begins. Most people have no idea what really happens behind Congress doors, and honestly, I wish I could have stayed that naive. But once you're inside, once you see how the system actually operates, there's no going back to believing in the fairy tale version of American democracy that we're all taught in school. My first day in Congress, I thought I understood politics. I'd been a civil rights attorney for years, fighting systemic injustice in Texas courts. I'd seen corruption, witnessed how money influences decisions, experienced firsthand how the powerful protect their interests at the expense of ordinary people. But Congress is a whole different level of manipulation and backdoor dealing that would shock even the most cynical observer. The moment I stepped into that first closed-door committee meeting, I realized I wasn't just representing my district anymore. I was entering a war zone where the weapons are information, leverage, and secret alliances that can make or break not just careers, but the lives of millions of Americans. But what I discovered in my first month completely shattered my expectations. The morning I received that unmarked folder on my desk, I thought it was just another policy briefing. You know how naive that sounds now? Nothing in Congress is ever just another briefing. Every document, every conversation, every seemingly casual encounter in the hallway is calculated, strategic, designed to move someone's agenda forward while keeping the public completely in the dark about what's really happening. That folder contained information that would change everything I thought I knew about how decisions get made in Washington, and more importantly, who's really making them. See, when you watch Congress on C-SPAN or see clips on the news, you're watching political theater. It's a performance designed to make you think your representatives are debating issues, considering different perspectives, weighing the best interests of their constituents. But the real decisions, the ones that actually matter, happen in rooms you'll never see and conversations you'll never hear between people whose names you probably don't even know. The votes on the House floor, those are just the final act of a play that's already been written, directed, and rehearsed behind closed doors where the public has absolutely no access. I remember sitting in my first leadership meeting, listening to senior members discuss upcoming legislation, and slowly realizing that everything I'd been told about how bills become laws was essentially a comfortable lie. The process we learned in civics class about committees reviewing legislation, experts providing testimony, representatives carefully considering the merits of different proposals, that's not how it works. Not really. The real process involves phone calls from donors who've contributed millions to campaigns, private meetings with lobbyists who have more access to lawmakers than constituents ever will, and backroom negotiations where votes are traded like commodities on a stock exchange. But here's what really opened my eyes to the depth of the problem. There are members of Congress who've been there for decades who've never actually read the bills they vote on. Think about that for a moment. People making decisions that affect healthcare, education, criminal justice, economic policy, foreign relations decisions that literally determine whether families can afford medication, whether children get quality education, whether communities have clean water, and they're voting based on summaries prepared by staff members who are often more loyal to special interests than to the people those laws will impact. The day I decided to actually read every bill that came to a vote, my colleagues looked at me like I'd lost my mind. One senior member actually laughed and said, "Jasmine, nobody reads those things. That's what staff is for." But when I started reading the actual language, the real provisions buried in thousands of pages of legal text, I discovered provisions that directly contradicted what we were told the bills would accomplish. Sections that would benefit specific corporations or industries in ways that had nothing to do with the stated purpose of the legislation. Loopholes that would essentially nullify the protections the public thought they were getting. And then there are the amendments. Oh, the amendments. This is where the real manipulation happens, where special interests get their payoffs, where deals made in private get codified into law. Most amendments are introduced at the last minute, sometimes literally hours before a vote, with language so complex and technical that even if members wanted to understand what they were voting on, they wouldn't have time. I've watched billion-dollar giveaways to specific companies get slipped into bills about veterans' health care or disaster relief, knowing that anyone who votes against the amendment will be accused of opposing veterans or disaster victims. But what shocked me most wasn't the corruption I expected. It was the casual way everyone accepted it as normal. The shrugging, the eye rolling when I asked too many questions, the patient explanations about how this is just how things work, and you'll understand when you've been here longer. As if learning to accept corruption was some kind of professional development, like learning to use the congressional phone system or figuring out where the good bathrooms are located. The lobbying industry in Washington is unlike anything most Americans can imagine. These aren't just people who occasionally visit their representatives to advocate for issues they care about. These are professional manipulators with unlimited budgets, detailed intelligence about every member's vulnerabilities, weaknesses, family situations, financial pressures, career ambitions. They know things about sitting members of Congress that those members probably don't remember telling anyone. And they use that information with surgical precision to get what their clients want. I started keeping a record of every interaction I had with lobbyists, and within 6 months, I had documentation of attempted bribery, blackmail, and manipulation that would make your head spin. Not crude, obvious attempts, but sophisticated psychological operations designed to make representatives believe that voting for corporate interests was actually in their constituents' best interests. Carefully crafted research reports with cherry-picked data, emotional appeals about job losses or economic impact, veiled threats about campaign funding or media coverage. The pharmaceutical industry is particularly skilled at this game. I've sat in meetings where lobbyists presented heart-wrenching stories about patients who need expensive medications, arguing that any attempt to lower drug prices would eliminate the research funding needed to develop life-saving treatments. They bring in patients, real people with real medical needs, to testify about how grateful they are for medications that cost more per month than most families earn. What they don't mention is that those same medications are often available in other countries for a fraction of the cost, or that the research they claim to fund is often actually subsidized by taxpayers through government grants. But pharmaceuticals are just one industry. The defense contractors have their own sophisticated operation, constantly pushing for unnecessary weapon systems and foreign interventions that generate massive profits while putting American lives at risk. The financial industry works to prevent regulations that would protect consumers from predatory lending and market manipulation. The fossil fuel industry fights every attempt to address climate change or develop clean energy alternatives. And they all coordinate their efforts, sharing information and strategies to maximize their influence over the legislative process. What makes this particularly insidious is how they've learned to co-opt the language of public interest. Every corporate welfare program is presented as job creation. Every environmental rollback is framed as reducing regulatory burden on small businesses. Every tax break for the wealthy is described as economic stimulus that will benefit everyone. They've become masters at making their private interests sound like public benefits, and too many members of Congress either fall for it or pretend to fall for it because it's politically convenient. The committee system, which is supposed to provide expertise and careful consideration of complex issues, has been completely captured by the industries it's meant to regulate. The House Financial Services Committee is dominated by members who receive massive contributions from banks and investment firms. The Energy and Commerce Committee is loaded with representatives who are essentially employees of oil and gas companies. The Agriculture Committee is run by people who represent agribusiness interests rather than farmers or consumers. And the revolving door between Congress and K Street ensures that everyone understands the unspoken rules. Staffers know that if they play ball while working on Capitol Hill, there are lucrative lobbying jobs waiting for them when they leave government service. Members know that if they don't rock the boat too much, there are consulting contracts and board positions available after they retire from Congress. This creates a system where the people writing our laws and regulations are constantly auditioning for their next job with the industries they're supposed to be overseeing. But it's not just about money, though money is certainly a huge part of it. It's about access, information, and social pressure. Washington is a small town where everyone knows everyone, where your social standing and professional opportunities depend on maintaining relationships with the right people. When the same lobbyists who are trying to influence your vote are also the people you see at dinner parties, charity events, and social gatherings, when your spouse or children develop friendships with their families, the lines between personal and professional relationships become completely blurred. The intelligence agencies add another layer of complexity that most people never consider. When CIA or NSA officials brief members of Congress on classified intelligence, how do you know what's real and what's being presented to manipulate your vote on defense spending or foreign policy? How do you question information when you're told that asking too many questions could compromise national security? How do you represent your constituents' interests when you're told that what they want could endanger American lives, but you can't explain why because the information is classified? I've been in briefings where intelligence officials presented information that directly contradicted everything I thought I knew about a particular situation, but when I tried to ask follow-up questions or request additional documentation, I was told that the information was too sensitive to discuss in detail. How convenient that the information supporting expensive military interventions or surveillance programs is always too classified to scrutinize, while the intelligence that might support diplomatic solutions or spending reductions never seems to be available at all. The media coverage of Congress is almost as misleading as the process itself. Journalists who depend on access to sources for their stories can't afford to ask too many uncomfortable questions or dig too deeply into subjects that might embarrass powerful people. The result is reporting that focuses on political drama and personality conflicts while ignoring the substance of what's actually happening. You'll see detailed coverage of who said what to whom in a committee hearing, but almost no investigation into who wrote the legislation being discussed or what interests are served by its passage. Social media has made this worse, not better. Now, members are incentivized to create viral moments and dramatic sound bites rather than doing the careful, boring work of actually understanding complex issues and crafting effective solutions. I've watched colleagues spend more time crafting tweets than reading bills, more energy on managing their online image than building relationships with constituents. The performative aspect of modern politics has completely overwhelmed the substantive work that government is supposed to be doing, and the fundraising never stops. Never. While we're supposed to be focusing on legislation, analyzing policy options, meeting with constituents, we're constantly being pulled into fundraising events, donor meetings, campaign strategy sessions. Members spend more time asking wealthy people for money than they do learning about the issues they're voting on. How can you represent the interests of working families when you're spending most of your time talking to millionaires and billionaires about their priorities? The pressure is relentless and comes from every direction. Party leadership wants loyalty and predictable votes. Donors want favorable legislation and access. Lobbyists want specific outcomes and continued relationships. Media wants dramatic quotes and controversial positions. Constituents want solutions to complex problems that often don't have simple answers. And underlying all of it is the constant awareness that if you don't play the game correctly, if you ask too many questions or challenge too many powerful interests, your career can be destroyed with a few phone calls and some negative media coverage. But what really keeps me up at night is thinking about all the legislation that never gets considered, all the solutions that never get discussed, all the reforms that never get proposed because they would threaten the interests of people who have too much power to cross. How many problems could we solve if we were actually working for the American people instead of for the corporations and special interests that have captured our political system? How many lives could we improve if we were focused on policy outcomes instead of political theater? The healthcare crisis in this country isn't complicated to solve from a policy perspective. Every other developed nation has figured out how to provide healthcare to their citizens without bankrupting families or letting people die from treatable conditions. But we can't have that conversation honestly because the insurance companies and pharmaceutical giants have too much influence over the legislative process. They've convinced too many members that any reform would be catastrophic while they continue to profit from human suffering. Climate change presents an existential threat that requires immediate, dramatic action, but we can't take the necessary steps because fossil fuel companies have spent decades and billions of dollars convincing politicians that environmental protection and economic growth are incompatible. Meanwhile, they're actively suppressing technologies and policies that would create jobs, reduce energy costs, and protect the planet for future generations. Economic inequality has reached levels not seen since the robber baron era, with a few individuals controlling more wealth than entire nations, while working families struggle to afford basic necessities. But we can't address this through progressive taxation or antitrust enforcement because the billionaires and megacorporations have essentially purchased our political system and use it to protect their advantages while shifting costs and risks to everyone else. The student debt crisis is destroying the financial future of an entire generation, but we can't provide relief or reform the system because the banks and debt collection companies make too much money from the current arrangement. The housing crisis is pricing out the middle class and creating homelessness in communities across the country, but we can't address it because real estate investors and developers have too much political influence. And all of this happens while the public is told that these problems are too complex to solve, that there isn't enough money for solutions, that any significant change would have unintended consequences that would make things worse. It's gaslighting on a national scale designed to make people accept suffering and injustice as inevitable when they're actually the result of deliberate policy choices made to benefit a small group of extremely powerful people. When I try to explain this to constituents, I can see the disbelief in their eyes. They want to believe that their government works the way they were taught it works in school. They want to believe that their representatives are fighting for them, that the system is basically fair, even if it needs some reforms around the edges. The reality that their government has been captured by corporate interests and is systematically working against their interests is too disturbing for many people to accept. But ignoring the problem doesn't make it go away. It just ensures that things will continue to get worse for ordinary Americans while getting better for the people who have already rigged the system in their favor. And that's why I decided to speak out, even though I know it will make my job harder and my career shorter. Someone has to tell the truth about what's really happening behind those closed doors. Someone has to explain why Washington seems so disconnected from the needs and priorities of regular people. Someone has to break the code of silence that protects corruption and enables injustice. The American people deserve to know that their representatives are often representing everyone except them. They deserve to understand why policies that would improve their lives never seem to get serious consideration, while policies that benefit wealthy donors and powerful corporations sail through the legislative process. They deserve to know that the dysfunction and gridlock they see in government isn't accidental or inevitable, but is often the result of deliberate strategies by people who profit from dysfunction and gridlock. Most people have no idea what really happens behind Congress doors, but they should, because once enough people understand how the system actually works, we can start demanding that it work differently. We can start electing representatives who will actually represent us instead of the highest bidder. We can start holding our government accountable for serving the public interest instead of private interest. We can start building the democracy we were promised instead of accepting the oligarchy we've been given. That's why I'm here telling you these uncomfortable truths, not because I enjoy shattering illusions or making people cynical about government, but because I believe that democracy only works when citizens understand what they're dealing with. And right now, what we're dealing with is a system that has been systematically corrupted and captured by forces that do not have your best interests at heart. But knowing that is the first step toward changing it. The voting process itself has become a complete charade that would be laughable if it weren't so tragic. I've sat in the House chamber watching members rush in from fundraising events completely unaware of what they're voting on, casting their votes based on colored cards handed to them by party leadership. Green for yes, red for no, with no understanding of the legislation's content, its implications, or its real-world impact on the people they're supposed to represent. It's like watching a grotesque game show where the prizes are billion-dollar government contracts and the losers are American families who will pay the price for decades. But here's what made me realize just how deep this rabbit hole goes. During my first Appropriations Committee meeting, I watched senior members allocate hundreds of millions of dollars to programs that don't exist, in districts that don't need them, for purposes that make no sense. All because specific lobbyists had made specific requests tied to specific campaign contributions. When I asked questions about the rationale behind these allocations, the uncomfortable silence that followed told me everything I needed to know. Nobody expected anyone to ask rational questions about how taxpayer money gets spent. The budget process is perhaps the most corrupted aspect of the entire system. What the public sees as debates about fiscal responsibility and government priorities is actually an elaborate shell game designed to hide massive wealth transfers from working families to connected corporations and wealthy donors. The real budget decisions happen in private meetings between Appropriations Committee members and industry representatives, where specific dollar amounts are negotiated based on political contributions and future employment opportunities rather than public need or policy effectiveness. I remember reviewing one defense spending bill that included $2.3 billion for weapons systems that the Pentagon specifically said they didn't want or need. When I traced the money, I discovered that every single dollar was going to companies that had hired former Congress members as lobbyists or had made substantial contributions to current members' campaigns. The weapons would be built in districts represented by key committee members, ensuring continued political support for unnecessary military spending while real defense needs went unfunded. Healthcare legislation reveals the system's corruption in its most brutal form. I've watched pharmaceutical lobbyists literally draft bill language in committee rooms, writing provisions that would increase drug prices while telling committee members that the language was necessary to protect patient access to medications. The same companies that charge Americans $300 for insulin that costs $3 to manufacture were writing the laws that would allow them to continue this price gouging, and Congress members were accepting their drafts without question. The opioid crisis provides a perfect case study of how this corruption kills people. For years, pharmaceutical companies knew their painkillers were highly addictive and were being overprescribed, but they used their political influence to prevent regulation and oversight. They funded studies that downplayed addiction risks, hired former FDA officials to advocate for their products, and made campaign contributions to members who would oppose restrictions on prescribing practices. The result was a public health catastrophe that killed hundreds of thousands of Americans, but the companies responsible made billions in profits and faced minimal consequences. Mental health legislation follows the same pattern. Instead of funding community-based treatment programs that actually help people, we allocate money to for-profit psychiatric hospitals and pharmaceutical companies that profit from keeping people sick rather than helping them recover. I've seen bills that were supposedly designed to address the mental health crisis, but were actually written by industry lobbyists to increase profits while providing minimal actual care to people in need. The student loan system represents another form of legalized theft enabled by congressional corruption. Private lending companies wrote the legislation that created the current system, ensuring that student loans cannot be discharged in bankruptcy and that interest rates remain artificially high. They then hired former education department officials and Congress members to lobby for maintaining these profitable arrangements, while millions of young Americans are trapped in permanent debt servitude that prevents them from buying homes, starting families, or building financial security. But what really opened my eyes to the scope of the problem was discovering how foreign governments and multinational corporations use the same lobbying system to influence American policy in ways that directly harm American interests. I've said in briefings where it became clear that trade policies were being shaped by foreign companies that had hired American lobbying firms to represent their interests, often in direct opposition to American workers and businesses. The Saudi government, for example, has spent millions hiring former Congress members and State Department officials to lobby for weapons sales and favorable policies, even while supporting terrorist organizations and committing human rights atrocities. Chinese companies have used similar strategies to gain access to American technology and markets while maintaining trade practices that destroy American manufacturing jobs. Russian oligarchs have hired prestigious American law firms and lobbying companies to help them avoid sanctions and launder money through the American financial system. What makes this particularly galling is that these foreign influence operations are completely legal under current lobbying laws. As long as they register as foreign agents and file the proper paperwork, foreign governments and companies can buy influence over American policy just as easily as domestic corporations can. The result is that American foreign policy often serves the interests of foreign powers rather than American citizens, because foreign money talks just as loudly as domestic money in the halls of Congress. The tax code provides another window into how the system has been rigged against ordinary Americans. Every year, I watch Congress members add new loopholes and deductions that benefit specific companies or wealthy individuals, often written in language so technical and obscure that most members don't understand what they're voting for. Meanwhile, provisions that would actually help working families get stripped out of bills or watered down to meaninglessness. I've seen tax breaks worth hundreds of millions of dollars added to unrelated legislation in the middle of the night with no hearings, no public debate, and no analysis of their impact. These aren't broad policy changes designed to stimulate economic growth or address national priorities. These are specific favors for specific donors, disguised as economic policy. One amendment I reviewed would have saved a single corporation $180 million in taxes while providing no benefit to anyone else, but it was presented as a job creation measure. The infrastructure bills that get so much media attention as examples of bipartisan cooperation are actually masterpieces of political corruption. Instead of focusing money on the roads, bridges, and broadband networks that communities actually need, the funding gets allocated based on political considerations and corporate lobbying. I've seen rural districts with excellent infrastructure get massive highway projects they don't need, while urban areas with crumbling systems get minimal funding, all because the rural districts are represented by senior committee members who can deliver contracts to their preferred construction companies. Environmental legislation follows the same corrupt pattern. Bills that are presented as addressing climate change often contain massive subsidies for fossil fuel companies and provisions that actually increase pollution while creating the appearance of environmental action. Carbon trading schemes that were supposed to reduce emissions instead create new financial markets where Wall Street firms can profit from buying and selling pollution credits without actually reducing environmental damage. The renewable energy subsidies that sound progressive and forward-thinking are often structured to benefit large corporations rather than actually increasing clean energy production. Solar and wind projects get funded not based on their environmental impact or energy production efficiency, but based on their location in politically important districts and their connection to companies that have hired the right lobbyists. Water rights legislation provides another example of how public resources get privatized for corporate profit. I've watched Congress allocate public water resources to private companies for pennies on the dollar, while communities face water shortages and infrastructure crises. These deals are always presented as necessary for economic development, but the real purpose is to transfer public assets to private corporations that can then charge communities for access to their own water resources. Agricultural policy reveals how corporate welfare gets disguised as support for family farmers. The vast majority of agricultural subsidies go to massive agribusiness corporations rather than actual farmers, while small family farms get driven out of business by regulations written by and for industrial agriculture companies. Crop insurance programs socialize losses while privatizing profits, meaning taxpayers pay when crops fail, but corporations keep all the money when crops succeed. Food safety regulations are written by the same corporations they're supposed to regulate, ensuring that compliance costs drive small producers out of business while creating barriers to entry that protect established companies from competition. I've reviewed legislation that would have shut down local farmers markets and community-supported agriculture programs while exempting industrial food processors from basic safety requirements. Immigration policy provides another clear example of how corporate interests override public interest in the legislative process. The same business groups that publicly support strict immigration enforcement privately lobby for guest worker programs and enforcement policies that ensure a steady supply of low-wage labor while preventing workers from organizing for better conditions. They want immigration policies that keep workers vulnerable and wages low, regardless of the human cost or the impact on American workers. Border security spending goes primarily to private contractors who profit from detention facilities and surveillance technology rather than actually securing the border. These companies then use their profits to lobby for more contracts, creating a self-perpetuating cycle where border security becomes a profit center rather than a public safety priority. Meanwhile, the underlying immigration issues that create border problems never get addressed because solving them would eliminate profitable business opportunities. The criminal justice system operates under the same corporate capture model. Private prison companies lobby for mandatory minimum sentences and three strikes laws that ensure steady demand for their services, regardless of public safety outcomes or rehabilitation effectiveness. They hire former Congress members and judges to advocate for policies that increase incarceration rates because more prisoners mean more profits. Drug policy remains locked in failed strategies, not because they're effective at reducing drug use or crime, but because they're profitable for private prisons, law enforcement contractors, and pharmaceutical companies that profit from treating addiction as a medical condition requiring expensive ongoing treatment rather than addressing its underlying causes. The war on drugs continues not because it works, but because it generates billions of dollars in contracts and campaign contributions. Police and corrections officer unions lobby for policies that protect bad actors from accountability while increasing funding for equipment and personnel, often in direct opposition to community safety and police effectiveness. I've seen legislation that would have improved police training and accountability get defeated because union lobbyists convinced members that reform efforts were anti-police, when they were actually designed to make policing more effective and safer for everyone. Education policy gets distorted by the same corporate influence that affects every other area of government. Standardized testing companies lobby for policies that require more testing, regardless of educational effectiveness. Textbook publishers influence curriculum standards to ensure demand for their products. For-profit colleges lobby against regulations that would protect students from predatory lending and worthless degree programs. Charter school policies get promoted not because they improve educational outcomes, but because they create opportunities for private companies to profit from public education funding. I've reviewed legislation that would have diverted billions from public schools to private companies while reducing oversight and accountability for how that money gets spent. The healthcare insurance industry has perfected the art of writing legislation that appears to expand coverage while actually increasing their profits and reducing care quality. The Affordable Care Act, despite its benefits, was largely written by insurance company lobbyists who ensured that it would increase their customer base while maintaining their ability to deny claims and limit coverage. Every subsequent healthcare reform proposal gets filtered through the same corporate influence process. Pharmaceutical companies don't just lobby for favorable regulations and patent protections. They actively work to prevent competition from generic drugs, natural treatments, and alternative therapies that might reduce demand for their products. They fund research that supports their marketing goals while suppressing studies that show negative outcomes. They hire former FDA officials to help navigate the regulatory process they used to oversee. Medical device companies follow similar strategies, lobbying for regulations that favor their products while creating barriers for competitors. They fund medical conferences and continuing education programs that promote their devices while downplaying alternatives. They provide financial incentives to doctors and hospitals that use their products extensively. Technology policy reveals how corporate capture extends into areas that didn't exist when most current ethics rules were written. Social media companies lobby for regulations that would entrench their dominance while appearing to address privacy and competition concerns. They hire former government officials who understand the regulatory process and have relationships with current policymakers. Cryptocurrency and financial technology companies have created entirely new categories of lobbying designed to prevent regulation of their industries while gaining government legitimacy for their business models. They fund research that supports their policy positions while hiring former Treasury and SEC officials to advocate for favorable treatment. Data privacy legislation gets written by the same companies that profit from collecting and selling personal information, ensuring that apparent privacy protections actually legitimize data collection practices while preventing meaningful regulation. Internet service providers lobby for policies that appear to support net neutrality while creating loopholes that allow them to prioritize traffic from companies that pay for premium access. The space industry represents a new frontier for the same old corruption patterns. Defense contractors lobby for space-based weapon systems and surveillance programs that may not enhance national security, but definitely enhance their profit margins. Commercial space companies seek government subsidies and contracts while avoiding the safety and environmental regulations that apply to other industries. But what truly keeps me awake at night is not just the scope of the corruption, but how normalized it has become. New members arrive in Congress thinking they're going to change the system, but within months they're attending the same fundraisers, taking meetings with the same lobbyists, and voting for the same corporate welfare programs as everyone else. The pressure to conform is enormous, and the consequences of resistance are severe. Members who ask too many questions find themselves excluded from leadership positions, stripped of committee assignments, and targeted for defeat in primary elections funded by the same corporate interests they challenged. The message is clear: play along or face professional destruction. Most members choose to play along, telling themselves that they can do more good by working within the system than by fighting it from the outside. The staff who actually write the legislation and brief members on complex issues are often recent college graduates with no expertise in the subjects they're handling. They rely heavily on information provided by lobbyists who are happy to educate them about industry perspectives and policy options. Over time, these staffers develop relationships with lobbyists that often lead to lucrative job offers when they leave government service. The result is a system where corporate interests are systematically prioritized over public interests, where wealthy donors have more influence than entire communities of voters, and where the government that's supposed to serve the people primarily serves the powerful. This isn't a conspiracy theory or a partisan political attack. This is the documented, observable reality of how our government actually operates, as opposed to how we're told it operates. Breaking this cycle requires more than just electing different people to the same corrupted system. It requires fundamental structural changes to how campaigns are funded, how lobbying is regulated, how legislation is written and considered, and how government officials are held accountable for serving public rather than private interests. But those changes can't happen as long as the people with the power to make them are the same people who benefit from the current arrangement. That's why transparency becomes so crucial. When people understand how the system really works, when they see the specific ways their interests are being sold out to corporate profits, they can make informed decisions about what kinds of representatives they want and what kinds of policies they'll support. Democracy requires informed citizens, but our current system is designed to keep citizens uninformed about the most important aspects of how their government operates. Most people have no idea what really happens behind Congress doors because powerful interests have spent enormous amounts of money and effort to keep those doors closed, to complicate the processes, to hide the influence, and to maintain the comfortable fiction that government serves the people rather than the profits. But once you've seen behind those doors, once you understand how the machine really works, you can never unsee it, and neither should you.